Hello and welcome back to a extremely special and very exclusive episode of the Napoleonic Wars Podcast. Now today, the table have turned somewhat. In the co-pilot seat with me is our very own Dr. Memory, the Bow, Dr. Luke Reynolds. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well, sir. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited to sort of start shining the light in the eyes of our guest today. So in that chair, strapped in, ready to go, is Dr. Zack White, and we're going to be talking about a very exciting thing that has just been released. It is An Unavoidable Evil, which is a book about the siege warfare in the Age of Napoleon. Now, it's an edited collection, edited by his fair hand, that draws together established and emerging aspects of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that, from around the world to shed new light on all things siege warfare. How are you, Zach?
I am well. As I have made a habit of saying, I don't like being on this side of the mic. It's not okay. I'm the person who asks the questions, not answers them. So if I go into sulk mode, that will be my excuse as to why.
Are you feeling the pressure already?
What I'm doing is getting my excuses in early, as all good excuse makers do.
Good. Well, I'm going to dive straight in with the first question, and it's going to be as sort of as direct as it is broad. Dr. Zack White, why a book on sieges?
You basically turned around to me and gone, what is the point of what you've been doing for the last 5 years? Love it. Because it's the obvious place to start, right? We tend not to talk much about sieges, or if we do talk about sieges, then we do that sharp thing, essentially, which is, hey, let's talk about the Peninsular War and the Peninsular War sieges, and anything else kind of becomes very tangential and very sort of peripheral. So sure, you've got sieges like Genoa that, people talk about within a campaign context, but for the most part, nobody's bothered to sit down and really think about sieges, plural. We have had a little bit of work on British sieges during the Peninsular War. That was Frederick Myatt who did that. But before that point, and actually in fairness since, what you've had is isolated works. Siege of San Sebastian, let's do a book on that. Fantastic. Bruce Collins did a stunning job on that. Obviously, we've had books on Theodore Rodrigo, Badajoz, etc. However, nobody at the time that I dreamt up this concept had decided to go, well, what's happening across different sieges? So you've got this thing happening in the Iberian Peninsula, cool story. But how does that compare to Central Europe? How does that compare to Eastern Europe? How does that compare across the world? And so I kind of scratched my head a little bit and went, well, how hard can it be to pull something like this together? Because I was a young, naive, sprightly PhD student, and how hard could all of this historianing thing honestly be? 5 years later, the book's finally hit the bookshelf. So there's an indication of how hard it actually was. But I wanted to take what you might call the Alex Mikaberidze perspective in terms of, let's go global with this. Let's not just focus on the Peninsular War. Let's not just focus on Europe or Napoleon. Let's actually see, are there threads that we can pick out? What conversations are happening about how you conduct a siege? What changes in terms of how you conduct a siege? Does a siege even matter anymore during this period? And I think the common perception is no, because Napoleon, movement, the core system, we have this automatic thing that we reach for when we talk about warfare, which is that mobility and that change from that ancien regime style. But I'm not so sure that's entirely fair. And so this book kind of tries to draw together both emerging talent and some of the big heavy hitters that fans of the show know and love, to kind of unpick this and go, actually, what's going on here? The one thing I will say is that since I pitched this book, there has actually been a really important and significant volume on siege warfare by friend of the show, Gavin Daly. But that in itself looks at the British experience of sieges. So again, it doesn't kind of look at this multinational perspective. And so in some respects, it kind of takes the great stuff that's done there and goes, okay, this is great. What else can we bring into this discussion? So essentially, I'm hoping that it's part of a much more kind of positive, forward-thinking approach to looking at sieges during this period?
All right. So one of the things that this series does is peel back the curtain, right? It's to give our listeners a little bit of a peek into how these things are written, what they're done, and we're gonna give them a view that they don't often get here. So, give us your experiences. How did it feel when you realized that Storm and Sack was dropping?
In one sense, I was like, oh, insert some perhaps slightly guttural Germanic phrases in here. But in another sense, I was really pleased. Not least because every time Gavin produces a piece of work, I kind of go, yeah, that's a book I would have liked to have written, but probably would never have got to. So, at least that work's got done. And Gavin always does a stellar job with these things. So, you know that when one of his books drops, you're going to get some really interesting stuff out of it. Equally, because I was taking this sort of much more global perspective, in many respects, it just kind of reinforced the value of what I was doing. It was another stepping stone towards what I was trying to achieve, but perhaps focused the mind a little bit, particularly for me as somebody who then has to go and write the introduction to this book, that thing that nobody ever bothers to read, sort of explains the rationale behind what's going on, but is nonetheless kind of important in terms of framing what this book is and what the aims and the scope of it are, and sort of tries to knit everything together. It was kind of like, okay, great. But actually, this just kind of reinforces the point that I'm trying to make, which is that we need to take that and do more with it. Sort of Gavin Daly, Storm and Sack plus. Let's sort of inject some steroids into this and take it even further.
Now, Zach, I want to pull on a thread that you sort of opened up there. You've got this global perspective. You've gone all Alexander Mikaberitsa on it, on siege warfare here. Now, what does the book give us in terms of the relationships between sieges globally? What sort of patterns do we see? How are sieges similar across the globe, and what sort of differences do we see? For example, do we see that kind of siege etiquette that if you surrender, it'll be okay, but if you stand, you will be sacked? Like, what's that sort of relationship like across the globe?
This is one of the really interesting things that kind of fell out of it, as opposed to being a really apparent thing in the early phase, which is that sieges just get much, much more vicious. You take the Ancien regime period and you've got this sort of concept of an inverted commas gentlemanly siege, where there are certain rules and expectations, and this is all fallen out of the Vauban era of fortress design, where you've got these incredibly intricate, incredibly well-designed systems that are all about kind of glacis that protect the fortifications themselves. So it's very hard to actually hit the base of a wall. That means it's very hard to make a breach, which means that if you send anybody in to attack one of these places, they're going to get hit by these overlapping fields of fire and everybody is going to die. So just don't do it. Now, there is a balance that's struck here, which is that everybody recognizes during the Ancien regime era that you can still get into these fortresses, but once the soldiers have got in, everybody's blood is going to be up and they're going to want revenge. So actually, why don't we have this agreement whereby if a practicable breach is made in the wall, at that point, yes, okay, it's legitimate for you to discuss terms of surrender. And then the garrison can march out with the honors of war, the new occupying force marches in, and it's all done in a very carefully controlled, reasonable fashion. That is the standard playbook during the Ancien regime. We're very accustomed to it. And so it makes sieges quite a kind of integral part of campaigning, because if you can hold somebody up long enough by doing a siege, that means you can bring in a field army to start kind of shepherding them away, and kind of it just changes the whole dynamic of what's going on. Now, Napoleon takes all of that and basically throws it in the fire, because he decides that anybody who is holding a French fortification and surrenders before an assault has taken place will face the full wrath of the French military justice system. He wants sieges to not just delay the enemy, He wants them to degrade the enemy's capacity to continue to fight. If you are going to commit, then you are going to suffer the consequences. You're going to have a smaller field army, which means Napoleon can sweep in and then face an easier fight on the battlefield. And what this means is that, as we see fundamentally during the Peninsular War, a lot of these situations where ordinarily a fortress might have surrendered end up being these very bloody instances, whether it's Ciudad Rodrigo, whether it's Badajoz, San Sebastian. Almeida would have potentially gone the same way, except that Wellington didn't want to assault Almeida. He wanted to blockade it. And so you've got this bloodiness to sieges that we see in the western half of Europe. But actually what becomes very interesting is that when you take the perspective out in India and look what the British do out there, when you look at what's happening in Eastern Europe, particularly with the Russian campaigns against the Ottomans, this bloodiness is actually really quite constant. So the British way of waging war in India, particularly when it comes to taking these sort of hill forts, which aren't Vauban-esque in style, they're still impressive fortifications, but they don't have that same level of seeking to hide, if you like, the fortifications behind a protected glacier and all the rest of it. The idea is kind of all-out assault. Sure, you're going to knock a hole in the wall, but you're going in, and you're going in tough. And if you look at Wellesley at Ahmednagar, for example, there is no bombardment. There is no preparation. It's just get some ladders. You're going over that wall. I don't care about the fact that we haven't done any intel and that we haven't worked out that there's no fire step on the other side of that wall. So you are going to struggle to do anything when you get to the top of it. You're just going in all guns blazing. And Josh Proven's chapter essentially starts to look at all of these different operations and identifies this commonality that the British feel out in India particularly that the way to suppress the local population is a kind of shock and awe mentality, that you are going to demonstrate to them that it doesn't matter how many guns they have in their fortifications. And the artillery of the Maratha armies and other native armies out in India is very impressive. It's very well developed. It doesn't matter how much artillery you've got or how well trained it is. We're coming in anyway. You cannot stand against us if you hide in your forts. And actually, if you stand against us on the battlefield, then we'll mop you up anyway. And because of this mentality of the need for shock and awe, they are more and more inclined to just hurl men at the problem, which inevitably leads to very bloody clashes. In Alex Mukabridze's chapter on the Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 12, and equally in Eugene Mirkinkov's work on the Siege of Izmail, again, we see this horrendously bloody assault. And Eugene is sort of trying to use this to better understand what's the military culture like in the Russian army, that they're prepared to take losses on a scale that makes, frankly, Badajoz look like a casual Sunday stroll by comparison. So actually, something happens between sort of that transition from the Ancien regime into the sort of revolutionary and Napoleonic era, where sieges are just becoming more vicious. And there are lots of reasons that we can speculate for that. But I wonder if there's a change in mentality in terms of timescales. And actually, there's a shift in people thinking we need results fast. And the only way to achieve results fast in a siege situation is through the expenditure of your men's lives.
David Bell has entered the chat. So this is a very interesting thread running through this, right? This change in attitude and this change in sort of the view of time, which when paired with nationalism and things like that produces really bloody results. But I actually want to bring this back to something you said earlier, because you mentioned Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. And Wellington is famously criticized for his handling of sieges, largely because he's viewed as impatient. Right? He wants to get on with it. He much prefers, actually a little bit like Napoleon, a nice battle where he can change things and gain an advantage and all of that. But is this fair in light of what's being shown here? Is this fair in light that everyone is pushing for faster results, for bloodier sieges as a result of that? Or is Wellington actually on Trent?
It's a fantastic question. Inevitably, there are two ways you can spin this. My gut has always been that when you look at Wellington Wellesley at any stage in his career, sieges are probably the chink in his armor. Like there's a lot that he can do very well on a battlefield, but the reason I think that sieges are such a challenge for him is that he can't Wellington a siege. We're very accustomed with sort of Wellington's way of waging war, which is minute attention to detail and micromanaging as much as he humanly can. Now, he does try and do that on occasions, and Mark Thompson's chapter is really interesting in highlighting that the best of his sieges, which is unquestionably the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812, blitzkrieg style assault, that literally the news that Ciudad Rodrigo is under siege has barely reached Salamanca before Ciudad Rodrigo itself has fallen. The thing is over in something like 11 days, or is it 9 days? Like it's insanely quick, this whole operation. And part of the reason for that is meticulous planning, because he's been prepping for this, bringing in a new artillery train, making sure that all of the powder provisions are good to go in the region around Almeida. And then, of course, he picks his timing. You know, nobody's expecting an assault in the depths of winter because it's just mad. And it's so horrendous for the troops themselves. They are having to hack away at frozen ground. In order to get back to their encampment, they have to cross a frozen river that's full of ice. These are not conditions that you would expect. So when Wellington is able to do his thing, actually, sure, he's really good with sieges, but you can't manage that every single time that you go on campaign, because there isn't the capacity, there isn't the materiel. And this is part of one of many reasons why Badajoz is less good seems like a really awful phrase. I mean, Badajoz, it has far more intricate defense systems around it, far more in the way of kind of outlying works. Ciudad Rodrigo actually has been breached a couple of times, and Wellington picks that same point for his assault, so he's able to capitalize on that because the repair work at Ciudad Rodrigo has been really shoddy, which is part of the reason that the siege is so quick. Badajoz, completely different situation. But again, he doesn't have the perfect siege train. He's still having to sort of pick bits and pieces. And let's bear in mind, he's tried both of these places before. He hasn't been able to get into Badajoz. This is something like the third attempt, actually, in terms of sieges. Burgos, what a pig's ear. Why? Because he hasn't got the powder. He hasn't got the shot. He hasn't got the guns. Because he can't Wellington the situation and just bring this siege train with him all the way, because it's completely impractical. San Sebastian is really complex, and there's an ebb and a flow to it. The place burns down. Like there are many kind of aspects to this, and crucially, he doesn't directly micromanage that siege. I mean, it's Wellington, so micromanagement is a relative concept in these situations, but the siege is given to 5th Division, so it's not sort of the only thing that he's got on his plate, because he's dealing with the assault south by the French troops. So to come back to your question, does he do sieges well? Not brilliantly. Is there a consistency here that actually all sieges are awful? Yes, no doubt about that. You look at the French do sieges quite well in the grand scheme of things. There's a lovely chapter in at the end of this book by Silvia Gregorio Sainz, where she looks at the French siege of Castro Urdiales, and what she finds is that bloodiness and that vicious reprisal that we very much associate with a British way of responding to the aftermath of a siege. Actually, the French are doing that as well, which sort of suggests that this is a soldier problem as opposed to a British problem that we see in terms of those reprisals post-siege. But I still think that Wellesley, if you're going to be objective and if you're going to critique the man thoroughly, you have to look at his siegecraft and acknowledge that it's just not on a par with what he can do on a battlefield.
I think it's really interesting to look at the relationship between sort of Wellington's battlefield success, and I mean like pitch battle success and siege warfare. But I want to go to the sort of opposite end of the sort of chain of command here. What sort of sense do you get about how soldiers feel about investing a city or a fortress? Do they feel, is there some sort of a different relationship perhaps with this kind of more static warfare than something that might be a little bit more kinetic, the sort of traditional open pitch battle style?
It's a great question, and inevitably it's always going to depend on what you cite in terms of your source material as to the perspective. You would absolutely be able to find people who go flipping hell, or words to a stronger effect. These sieges are just diabolical. And when you look at, for example, Edward Costello's account, and I find Costello's account very interesting because I think he's partly complicit in some of the fundamentally atrocities that happened post Badajoz, but doesn't want to admit to that and looks back on it with a great deal of shame. There's a sort of a tension here, which is we went through hell to get into this place, but actually we then brought that hell with us into the city, and I'm not sure that I'm okay with that. Now, the best indicator actually is, what do soldiers do in these situations? Because that's ultimately your indicator of how soldiers feel in that moment. And it is astonishing what these guys do in terms of assaulting time and time again over the bodies of their comrades in situations where even officers will turn around and go, look, I've got no right to ask you to do this, but we need to get in this city. Are you with me? And the fact that there are so many incredibly bloody assaults on these fortifications that ultimately end up being successful, I think speaks volumes about how soldiers perceive their job. They are there to go and fight whoever, and they know that these guys aren't thick. They know that a siege is a totally different animal, a different monster fundamentally to what they're dealing with in battle. But there are a few things at play. One is the inner confidence. Ultimately, all of these guys have to back themselves in a fight. So when you look at the British or the French, they all think they can win because they are insert name of army here. In some instances, and you see this particularly in the Siege of Ishmael that Eugene talks about, God is invoked quite a lot as a way of trying to motivate troops, to the point where in some cases you've got priests trying to lead these guys forwards. So you've got these almost like warrior monk style figures trying to encourage these men. And I find that really interesting because I don't see a lot of that in my line of work. I do not see big religious influence on the everyday soldier. So I think there's something really interesting going on there, which might speak to Russian culture. It might speak to Russian military culture, or it might be something that we've missed and we haven't found the evidence for with regards to other armies during this period. But obviously it's complicated and it differs depending on each nation. I think that also there's an expectation of reward. And you see this with people like, for example, William Lawrence, prior to the siege of Badajoz, where he very frankly admits in his memoir that he and the guys, they had planned their fundamentally thieving operation. They had been to Badajoz before. They had seen where the silversmith shops were, and a mate made sure that he had a length of candle wrapped up, stuffed in his, I don't know if it was in his pack or his haversack or quite where it might have been, but he made sure he had a candle with him. And their plan was to hit the silversmith shops first. And to do that, they volunteered for the Forlorn Hope. So you've got this really interesting tension here between an incredibly brave act. There's a reason the Forlorn Hope is called the Forlorn Hope, and that's because everybody expects that you will die. But if you succeed, you will get the rewards. Now, the rewards are meant to be promotions, medals. I'm not sure if there's actually financial reward in terms of pay. I don't think there is, but certainly, the respect of the army will be with you. Now, clearly, the guys making up that party have a different mentality, which is, yeah, sure, you can promote me, you can give me all of the honor and badges that you like, but if I get in first, I get all the spoils of the city. And there is this expectation that if you assault, the town then gets handed over to the successful occupants, the new occupiers, for a sacking. Now, as Gavin Daly looks at in his book, there are some really interesting questions about that and where that comes from and quite what is and is not permissible in that situation. But I think for the average soldier, it doesn't matter. They have this expectation of reward for their service, which includes plunder, whether it's battlefield dead or whether it's the stuff they're left lying around in a city. They don't really care. It's like, where's the shiny stuff? I've just risked my life. Give it to me. And so in terms of how these guys approach it, I think they are being gung-ho because they have to be gung-ho. I think in some instances they're drawing on whatever coping mechanisms are quite prominent within their culture at the time. But I think also the expectation of shiny stuff is getting them through. And I think there's also a red mist thing that happens. And we often use this to sort of almost kind of justify what happens after these sieges. And you can argue that either way. I've never been in combat. Neither has Luke. One of us on this call has been in combat. So Liam is far better placed to sort of talk about what combat does to an individual. But does it make it okay? I'm reluctant to say yes, it does. It means you can understand why it happens. But there is always that danger when we talk about sieges, just go, oh, it's just what happens in war. Well, sure, it is what happens in war, but that doesn't make it all right. And I do wonder about how these different factors interlock. And I'm not sure you can ever get to the bottom of that, but I think there is some red mist in there that probably takes the other factors and just turns the volume of them up to 11. When you have been through absolute hell, you kind of have to leave some of your morality and some of your humanity behind in that breach. And so until you come down from that, I suspect it kind of heightens the preconceptions and the illusions or the motivators that you've been indulging in to get you into that breach in the first place, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I think that was very well put. I'm now going to ask the most me question in this podcast, and I apologize.
Why am I not shocked?
I know. Look, at least it's not something about fashion and siege warfare. We can't go that far.
I wouldn't put it past you to try, let's be real. But anyway, carry on.
That is fair. So what happens to these fortresses, these walls, these castles after the wars? Because, you know, some of these are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Some of these are wonderful bits of tourism, but others are being basically left to rot to the point where there are even campaigns to try and preserve them. So talk us through that.
A lot depends on the where. Because depending on which city we're talking about and how rapidly that city expands in the 200 years that follows will affect the way in which those fortifications do or don't survive. The first thing to do is think about this in the sort of short term, in the sense of what happens to a fortress after it's taken. Well, the thing that happens the next day is you clear the bodies. And then as soon as you've done that, you start the repair work, because that fortress needs to be functional should the enemy try to retake it. So initially, there's a lot of kind of focus on repair and preservation and actually thinking about the next one in terms of actually we've taken this approach to successfully get inside these set of fortifications. Do we now need to do some remedial work to make sure that this weak spot that we've identified can't be exploited again in the future? And that's why you start to see the building of sort of outer fortifications that take bits of high ground that are designed to stop people from finding those angles in order to start to breach fortifications. So in the very short term, it's all about repair and expansion, fundamentally, to make sure that they are militarily as domineering as you can possibly make them. Now, in times of peace, nobody gives a monkeys about fortifications. Actually, fortifications can be quite restrictive because they hem a city in. That's the point of them, right? They are there to protect what's inside the wall. But in times of economic expansion post-war, actually being hemmed in becomes really restrictive and really counterproductive because there's nowhere to go. Like there's this massive glacier or whatever. And you do see people either trying to farm this land or building upon it. And Beatrice de Graaf's work is really interesting on this. Within the book, she does a chapter on what becomes termed the Wellington barrier, which is all about the negotiations that happen with the Congress of Vienna about, okay, what happens now? How do we stop France from becoming resurgent? And one of the answers to that is, hey, forts. Why don't we build a whole series of fortifications on the Allied side of the French border, whilst reducing fortifications on the French side of the border that basically means the French are vulnerable and the rest of Europe isn't. And the idea is that this is going to be some kind of, at the very least, delaying line of fortifications. If folks are familiar with the Second World War, they might know about the Maginot Line, this set of fortifications that the French build after they are sick of being invaded by Germany. And it's a similar kind of concept. Look, let's just hold these French guys up, in the case of the Wellington barrier, with this long string of fortifications. The trouble is, corruption is really quite prominent. And when one of these fortresses is actually sort of unveiled and the king turns up to attend this unveiling and this laying of a stone, some of the ramparts collapse because somebody's decided that rather than putting the correct types of mortar and the correct building materials into this, they're going to skimp on the building materials and pocket the surplus. So it becomes a bit of a kind of egg on the face thing. But the mentality is actually fortresses really matter. They matter for the future security of Europe. Now that's great in the sort of 10, 15-ish years after the Napoleonic Wars. But as time moves on, firstly, there's the expense. Fortresses are expensive to keep and maintain. They also become, as I've explained, impractical. And so you get a lot of kind of bleed where people start sort of setting up stalls, and then the stalls become a little bit more established. And then you get these kind of shanty town style developments on the fortifications. And eventually, city planners, particularly as you get further into the 19th century, look at these and go, look, we've got these peace treaties. Do we really need these fortifications? Actually, the nature of warfare has moved on a little bit, particularly as you get towards the 20th century. And so you see the mentality on fortifications shift because the nature of what you need is actually very different. And rather than having one sort of castle on steroids, which is fundamentally what we're talking about during the 18th and early 19th century, what you need is a series of forts that are interconnected. And so you need a ring of fortifications as opposed to a fortress as a single entity. And with all of that comes big changes in terms of the way in which these places are seen as useful. And so if a city expands rapidly, as some of them do, Paris has fortifications that disappear. Like Montmartre, for example, is fundamentally one of the focal points of the Battle of Paris in 1814. It has redoubts built upon it to defend the city, because if you've ever stood at Sacré-Cœur at the top of Montmartre, you've got the perfect vantage point across the city. It's an ideal place to bombard Paris from. So inevitably, it's a focal point for defense of the city. But if you've ever been to Montmartre today, you know that it is right in the center of the urban sprawl of northern Paris. And any indication of previous fortifications has just been bulldozed in the face of urban expansion. Same story in the Netherlands for a number of these fortifications. And at best, in many cases, you've got kind of situations where bits have been preserved because of heritage, and actually other bits have been knocked down. Exceptions to that are predominantly to be found, in my experience, in the Iberian Peninsula, not exclusively, but Theodore Rodrigo and Badajoz are famously very well preserved, as is Almeida and Elvas. Lines of Torres Vedras, you can debate if they're a siege fortification or quite what they are, but they're a series of forts, and they're in varying states of preservation. A lot of effort has gone into preserving those. But how much of that is actually tied in now with tourism and things like sharp factor and people knowing that actually you're not going to make millions drawing these people into these places, but actually there is a steady stream of income that can be made of people flying out for battlefield tourism, which is useful. And if you have those fortifications preserved, why wouldn't you make the most of it in terms of local history, local tourism, and all of those benefits? So it's a kind of a case of us focusing a lot on what's left, because the reality is, as with all of these battlefields, time has moved on and people have taken that land and they've used it for whatever they feel they need to. And just as battlefields have disappeared under industrial developments, so too have fortifications, because they are essentially just another type of battlefield.
Zach, you talked a lot there about the sort of physical legacy of these fortresses, and I suppose, by proxy, the sieges themselves. But I want to sort of quickly get your impression on the sort of the memorialization of this type of warfare. As you've said, some of these sieges were absolutely horrific, and I guess the impact will be different, depending on where in the globe that these sieges happened. But how are they remembered, or indeed misremembered now?
I think where there is so much bloodshed, there's always, this is true of all conflicts, right? There's always a temptation to embellish. And that starts at the fireside in the 24 to 48 hours immediately after any engagement. Private X turning around and saying, oh yeah, no, I managed to bayonet 5 Frenchmen, and somebody else sort of trying to one up them and all the rest of it. And somebody else going, nah, I saw you cowering behind that tree, pipe down. So there are always those kinds of embellishments that happen in the immediate aftermath. Depending on what happens, there's also a lot of scope for resentment. There is a massacre at the Siege of Ishmael, no other way of describing it. We've talked at length about what happens at Ciudad Rodrigo, at Badajoz, at San Sebastian. But there can also be misremembering that comes with that. San Sebastian is the classic case of this. There is a very, very prominent myth that the British deliberately set fire to San Sebastian because they were concerned it was going to be some kind of rival to, I don't know, Southampton or Portsmouth. Now, in reality, when you look at just the geography, the only reason you would think that is if you had never seen somewhere like Southampton or Portsmouth to compare it to San Sebastian. And San Sebastian is a beautiful city. That is not a denigration against the city of San Sebastian itself, but there was never any realistic prospect that the two were going to be rivals for commerce. And when you bother to look at the source material, it is very apparent that the city was already on fire before the British even got inside, to the point where they have to call off one of the attempted assaults because the fire is too close to the breaches and they're not going to be able to get in, even if they can get through the breach. So clearly that is one of those things that is a very prominent myth. People passionately believe this, but it's not borne out by reality. You also have the Chinese whispers when it comes to Badajoz, for example, and people sort of very unhelpfully sort of parroting figures like, 4,000 people, 4,000 civilians were murdered in Badajoz. And actually, in recent years, a lot of work has been done to look at how many people were inside Badajoz. And the best estimate that I can come to is maybe 1,200. So where are these 4,000 people that supposedly actually got massacred? But again, it's about the perception, and that taints the memory. I think sieges are much less palatable to people in terms of commemoration, in terms of memorialization, because of those aftermaths. They leave a bitter taste in the mouth. And if you are going to sort of start to commemorate and memorialize these events, you very quickly open yourself up to an accusation that you are basically condoning what happens in the aftermath. And that's not the case at all. You can have both. And we, particularly on this show, try to strike that balance very carefully of emphasizing the horrendous stuff that goes on alongside that, look, people died in their swathes trying to do this. And there was a point to this, which was in the case of the Peninsular War, certainly liberation. Now, you take that out to India, very different mentality. And this is why it's so important to do the Alex Mikaberidze on this stuff, because once you start to think about these different perspectives, suddenly you go, yeah, no, this idea of sort of an unending glorious feat of arms, it really does depend on which side of the ramparts you're stuck on, doesn't it? And what your future looks like as part of the population of that area that is now occupied by this incoming force. And so in India, are we pretending that the siege of Seringapatam is remembered fondly by its residents today? Please, let's get real. I've never been out to India, so all I can go off is anecdotal evidence, but I have heard people who've come back from visiting Gaulgur kind of say, yeah, the locals don't really know a huge amount about the history. Now, I'm always slightly hesitant with this kind of stuff because it's very easy to encounter a language barrier and very patronizingly go, oh, well, the locals don't understand their history. I've tried to have conversations with Spanish people. My Spanish is not very good, but try to have conversation with folks in Spain about, for example, Fuente Doñero, and try to talk about the battle there. And, that communication barrier makes it very hard to work out how much these people are aware of the context of what's happening. And equally, if you're taking the time to go to these places, you've probably got more of an active interest and a deeper knowledge than about 90% of the population of the world, because you've gone and studied it, because you've got that deep kind of interest. That means for the average bod who's living there, do they want to know where 4th Division was posted over the course of a particular city? Do they, heck? That's the place where they go, and that's where Costco is, or whatever the equivalent might be. It's not the site of 4th Division or the assault on whatever. So there is a lot to unpack there, and I think it ends up being quite fraught. I do think that more generally, sieges are pushed to the periphery for the simple reason that the battles are so much more spectacular. And I mean that in a few senses. In one sense, it's very easy to identify a winner because we haven't got the bitter aftertaste in the same way. Even after something like Vittoria, where a baggage train gets plundered, it's a baggage train. Who honestly cares in the grand scheme of things? But ultimately, they are still plundering. But it's easier to go, oh, well, the British with their Portuguese and Spanish allies sweep the field. Huzzah for the British. Or, oh, the French can't hold. Isn't it a terrible day for the Bonapartist regime in Spain? So that's easier to deal with. But because it's easier and because the outcomes are more emphatic, and because of the Napoleon factor in terms of those big set-piece battles that can result in such overwhelming and crushing victories that really do change the political landscape of Europe for the years to come, sieges, where all they're going to do is be a punctuation mark in a much bigger campaign, they really don't have the same appeal.
It's fascinating to see the change over time, because you go from the Siege of Vienna sort of marking the end of an entire era, the end of nations all the way through this. Okay, so we opened, actually before we came on microphone, before we started recording, I was complaining to Zach that the website for this book, which is hellion.co.uk, it's £20 as of the time of recording, doesn't actually list the table of contents. It doesn't list who's in this thing. So Zach, what is actually in this book? And if I can be evil for a second, Hellion comes to you and says, right, we're going to put one chapter on the website free to read. Which one do you pick?
Oh, that last one is unfair. That last one is just unpleasant. So I am going to park that and see if I can waffle my way around your question, because basically what you've asked me to do is pick a favorite, which is not kind to my long-suffering authors. So chapter 1, Alex Mukabaridze comes in strong, looking at the Russia-Ottoman War of 1806 to 12. And he's kind of looking at the fact that sieges, no, they really do play an important part in the way in which campaigns are thought about. If people are wondering why the book is called An Unavoidable Evil, it's actually drawing on Clausewitz, who says that, if you can avoid it, don't engage in siege operations. Sometimes they are an unavoidable evil. Sometimes you really do have to engage with them. But if you are going to engage with them, try not to make them the be all and the end all of the campaign. The objective of your campaign should not be to take that fortress. The objective should be, we use that fortress in order to achieve X in the longer term. And Alex kind of offers that really interesting analysis of what does a siege mean for the people at the time in terms of their planning and all the rest of it. And equally, if things go wrong, what impact does that have on your strategic options going forwards? Then Eugene Miakinkov continues with the Eastern European kind of section of the book by looking at the Siege of Izmail in 1790. And he's looking at Russian military culture during the period and trying to sort of get insights into how different nationalities, different national characters are kind of having an influence on the way in which this operation plays out. He looks very much at sort of factional infighting, the use of rewards and medals and all the rest of it to kind of say, okay, what does this tell us as a snapshot in time of how the Russian armed forces are operating? So there's a much bigger thing that kind of falls out of that chapter in terms of actually understanding the Russian army, which is not a topic that gets a huge amount of attention in the English language. Then we have Beatrice de Graaf, who kind of offers us a complete pivot. Rather than looking at operationally and tactically what sieges mean, she looks at aftermaths. So she looks at the Wellington line, the Wellington barriers, that fortification between the French and essentially the Dutch, and looks at everything from environmental degradation. What does it mean to the environment, to the surrounding landscape, actually, to go and build one of these fortresses on it? How does it affect the local economy in terms of destruction of woodland? How does it affect the topography of the landscape when actually you're going to dig these ditches and you need soil for embankments and all the rest of it? And takes that all the way through to what does it mean for a civilian to live in the literal shadow of these fortresses? How does that restrict your life? So it's a really important pivot to something that really is never the focus of any study of sieges, which is, so what happens when the fighting stops for the people who live in these places? Because if we do talk about the civilians, we talk about them as victims. And so it's really interesting to look at how they can be a part of what a fortification is and what it means. Then we move on to look at tactical innovations or not. And this is a really interesting and important perspective, I think, because we tend to think of sieges as not really being a site of innovation. We talk a lot about kind of innovations on the battlefield, innovations in tactics, in movement, that Napoleon's utilization of the core system, all of that. And Andrew Bamford basically looks at the bombardment of Antwerp and then starts to sort of look back through what the British have been doing and thinking about in terms of bombardments and the way in which they're effectively sort of looking at what happened at Copenhagen and rubbing their hands together and getting terribly over optimistic and thinking, great, we've got this new way of dealing with certain population centers. And particularly the parallel that's drawn here is we want to bombard the fleet that is in Antwerp. Why don't we just do a Copenhagen on it, blow it to smithereens, and it'll all be done in like the space of 48 hours. Spoiler alert, it's not over in 48 hours. So that kind of gives us a variety of perspectives. Then we start to go a little bit more global. And Josh Proven enters the chat with his look at British siege approaches out in India, which I talked about a great deal already. So I won't dwell more on that, but it was a really important aspect of this. And it was important to sort of build upon Gavin Daly's work in terms of looking at the British way, if you like, of conducting siege operations and kind of seeing, is there a sort of, not exactly an EIC way of doing sieges, but certainly a kind of British in India way of approaching it. How is the perspective different when the nature of the fortification is a bit different, and the reason that you're assaulting that fortification is fundamentally in order to expand the empire, as opposed to the mentality that happens elsewhere in a lot of British sieges, which is actually we're trying to liberate, or we're kind of constructing this narrative of we're liberating a local population, depending on whether or not we're out in a former French colony or whether we're in Spain and Portugal. Chapter 6 is where logistics comes to the fore. So at this point, we do kind of pivot to look at the Peninsular War, because the Peninsular War is important. It's a really nice kind of set of examples in terms of looking at siege operations and how they can be conducted. And so Mark Thompson looks at the logistics of sieges. What does it take to put together a siege train? What does a siege train even look like? How many bullocks do you need? And people will go, really, Zach? Bullocks? But actually, if you want to move these very heavy guns and their gunpowder and the fodder for the animals that need to move this stuff and the fodder for the animals that's moving the fodder, actually it becomes this horrific snowball that takes a huge amount of organization in order to get guns from point A to point B. And once you appreciate that, you really do get an understanding of why Wellesley doesn't have a siege train just knocking around a couple of miles behind the lines when he's at Burgos. And then finally, in a very poignant chapter, we turn to Silvia Gregorio Sainz, who looks, as I've said, at Castro Ordiales and re-emphasizes some of the points that have kind of come through a lot through this about things like brutality, about the challenges for civilians living in fortifications, and takes this very little known siege, which gets ignored mainly because the British aren't really there in any significant numbers, and then puts an interesting spin on it because she looks at how this is reported across both the Spanish press but also the British press, and kind of asks questions about the way in which this helps us to understand a whole series of things beyond sieges, like how you report on a siege actually is a really interesting thing in itself. And I think it goes to show that for all that I am keen that we start to develop these more overarching understandings, actually one of the ways that we do that is to continue to ask questions with these sort of micro study approaches, where we look at these case studies and go, what does that help us to understand about much bigger things? Because only when we look at the individual case studies that we can start to then understand the much bigger overarching themes and commonalities, or not, that are developing in siege warfare during this period.
Without question. And it sounds, I'm going to let you off the hook about my evil question. I'll get it from you in the pub when it's not on microphone. This sounds like an incredible book. I know it's already in my cart. Just a reminder, everybody, An Unavoidable Evil, Siege Warfare in the Age of Napoleon, edited by our own Zack White. You can buy it on www.hellion, that's 1L, by the way, .co.uk. And it is £20 as of time of recording, which is a £5 sale off its MSRP. Zach, thank you so very much. We'll turn the light out that's been shining in your eyes and stop demanding to know where you were on the night of June 18th, 1815, and leave it there. This has been another one of our Meet the Author, or in this case, Meet the Editor episodes, but we have so much coming down the pipeline for you. You want to subscribe to our Patreon. You want to subscribe on your podcast device of choice. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Podcast. Thank you for listening, and we will be back very soon.
Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access to all episodes, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-July 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Finley, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, and Simon Weathers. The Admirals, Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, and Rob Painter. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Bevan, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.